Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and welcome to another episode of In the Grand Scheme of Things, where I oftentimes kind of mainly talk about things like our data modeling related or, basically data design related. And in this episode, what I want to do is talk more about governance and basically data protection, and talk about the principle of data protection by design and by default. So the idea is that the way you model your data and the way you sort of design your data systems basically allow for that protection to exist. Okay, so instead of having like you have this existing data system and then you build protections around it, the protections are essentially embedded in the system. And there's several different like sort of principles to follow that kind of achieve sort of this sort of data protection by design. First is the idea of data minimization, the idea that when you're designing your different data models, you only put the information that's absolutely necessary for the purpose of that data. So that kind of covers like the first two principles, where it's data minimization and purpose limitation. So the idea is that, instead of having one model that has just like all the data for all the things, you sit there and say, okay, let's break this down, not just to denormalize, but for the purposes of governance, let's break this down to smaller models. So that way, one, I minimize the amount of information anyone gets access to when they get access to a particular model. And then there's a clear purpose for why that model exists. And then, you can always then go back and connect them and give people access to them depending on the purposes they need the data for. Okay. And so forth. So again, data minimization, purpose limitation. So again, make sure that your data models have a clear, a very clear, narrow purpose, not general purpose for why that particular model exists. Instead of saying, hey, here's general customer information, this might be like customer shipping information. So then again, that's very clear that that particular model is only needed if you're shipping things to customers. So we don't need to give access to people who don't need to ship things to customers. Versus saying customer information, where a variety of different actions with customers may need access to that particular model. Okay, and again, you're giving a minimal subset of customer information when you have that customer shipping information model versus just a customer model. Data retention, having mechanisms that make sure that you don't maintain data you don't need to hold longer than you don't need to. Okay, this could be sort of standard practices on a cadence of when you purge certain records, particularly when people request personal information or PII to be removed, when you have to do it within a certain basis based on regulations like GDPR, okay, the General Data Protection Regulation. Then there's the idea of access control. So basically, hey, not only do you want to make sure that you don't have access to data longer than you have to for the protection of people's information, but also you want to make sure you have controls to make sure that the information you do have is only accessible by those who should have it. Okay, this is like a really popular feature when it comes to like sort of like Dremio Enterprise. Okay, so for those who know who don't already know, I work for a company called Dremio that has a data lakehouse platform that's very useful for this kind of thing. And there you have the ability to like create like row and column masking rules. So that way only people with the right roles or people with the right sort of levels of access can see certain bits of information in any particular model. So not only can you have these sort of more narrowly defined purpose-driven models, but you can also make sure that, hey, if someone does have access to it because they do need some of that information, they're not going to see the columns or the rows they shouldn't have access to. Encryption and anonymization. So the idea here is you generally don't want data that's easily trace backable to, in a sense, like this is always like a big issue like social media and whatnot, where they're collecting a lot of information about, hey, like what are you clicking on? What are you doing? What are you liking? Things like that. And the idea here is, well, they shouldn't be able to know that, hey, like Alex Merced clicked on this specific like page or whatnot. Then now, based on the information they've gathered, they might be able to determine, hey, which ads I may see. But I shouldn't be able to like just do a query on the table and know, hey, this is Alex Merced's activity. Okay, so there's a certain level of thinking. Okay, how can I track this data without necessarily like attributing sort of very fine-grained data to like that initial user? Again, this is going to be for very particular sensitive information. And then of course you always want to encrypt data to make sure that if you get hacked or something like that, people can't necessarily just read the data. So they might be able to like steal, like you hear stories of these hacks where people like lock up the data, but it doesn't necessarily mean they can necessarily access the data if they don't have the encryption keys. So in that case, you may lose your data because they stole it and locked it up on you with these like sort of Trojan horse attacks, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have access to the data either. Okay. You know, so you want to make sure you have like all that encrypted and, you know, have those encryption keys sort of well hidden, so that way, you know, only the right systems and the right people can read those files. And then have audit trails. So the idea here is just basically making sure that anytime someone changes the data, all these kind of things, basically all the different sort of actions and events that are necessary to understand sort of what's going on with your data, to be able to recognize when something goes wrong. You want to have an audit trail of those. Okay, so you want to capture those data events. And essentially, if you follow those 6 principles: data minimization, purpose limitation, data retention, access control, encryption and anonymization, and audit trails, you know, you can have sort of very well governed, well protected data. Okay. But there's also, again, when you're thinking about sort of designing your individual models, there's different techniques you might want to consider. Okay. So basically, when you're drawing up your ERDs, your entity relationship diagrams for like a specific model, okay, you can sit there and notate it. So create metadata around the columns to document sort of like, this column is used for this purpose. This column is this level of sensitivity. So that way people there's documentation and there's awareness of sort of like, hey, what this data is for and when they should be careful. So metadata around your schema definitions is pretty useful. Okay. And again, make sure you run tests to make sure that, hey, the proper access controls are being adhered to. So don't just create the access controls, create dummy users who those like access controls would be applied to, and make sure that you only see the right levels of data when you access those data sets. So that way you make sure that you can feel confident that other people aren't going to be seeing the data that they should. And then, of course, you're always going to want to make sure you have a cadence of sort of feedback. So basically, with all your data users and legal and compliance people, you always want to make sure you're having regular meetings to make sure that, you know, any kind of concerns get escalated quickly and are addressed quickly. You know, generally, if you address all these things, you can generally have a pretty good data compliance and governance practices that'll avoid you any kind of regulatory fines, avoid you any kind of legal exposure, but also just make sure you protect your company's data and the data of your customers. Or, you know, basically, yeah, customers. But with that, hopefully was interesting conversation about sort of data governance and thinking about some of the principles around data governance as you design your data systems. But again, my name is Alex Merced. Do follow me on LinkedIn. If you don't already follow me on LinkedIn, make sure you subscribe to this podcast and my other podcasts. And have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all later.